September 17, 1945. The morning air hung thick with smoke and defeat over the bombed-out streets of Tokyo. In a makeshift detention center housed within the skeletal remains of what had once been a girls' school, 37 female Japanese Auxiliary Corps officers sat in silence on bamboo mats, their once proud Monpei work uniforms now little more than tattered rags clinging to their emaciated frames. The summer heat pressed down like a weight. But these women had endured far worse than discomfort. They had endured the complete collapse of everything they had been taught to believe in. Lieutenant Michiko Tanaka pressed her back against the cracked concrete wall, her fingers unconsciously smoothing the frayed edges of her uniform jacket. The fabric, originally a deep navy blue that had symbolized duty and sacrifice for the emperor, had faded to the color of ash. Beside her, Second Lieutenant Yuki Yamamoto stared at her hands that had once typed classified military dispatches, now trembling from malnutrition and uncertainty. Neither woman had eaten a proper meal in weeks. Neither had slept soundly since the 15th of August, when Emperor Hirohito's voice had crackled over the radio, speaking the impossible words of surrender. These were not ordinary Japanese women. They were graduates of the Women's Auxiliary Military Service Corps, the elite female officers who had dedicated their lives to serving the empire. They had believed with every fiber of their being that death was preferable to defeat. They had been trained to endure any hardship, to sacrifice everything for the glory of Japan. Yet here they sat, defeated, captured, and forgotten, living embodiments of a contradiction they could not comprehend. The war had demanded everything from Japanese women. In 1943, as the tide of battle turned against Japan, the government had mobilized every available resource, including its daughters. Young women like Tanaka and Yamamoto had volunteered enthusiastically, trading their colorful kimonos for military uniforms, their dreams of marriage and motherhood for dreams of dying honorably for the emperor. They had been taught that American soldiers were barbaric demons who would show no mercy to captured Japanese. They had been told that American women were weak, spoiled creatures who knew nothing of sacrifice or duty. The Women's Auxiliary Corps had swelled to over 200,000 volunteers by 1944. These women operated radio equipment, decoded messages, managed supply lines, and maintained communication networks across the Pacific Theater. They lived in barracks, marched in formation, and saluted the rising sun each morning with the same fervor as their male counterparts. They wore their Monpei uniforms with pride, understanding that these practical work clothes represented their contribution to the war effort. The loose-fitting trousers, originally worn by farmers in rice fields, had become a symbol of female patriotism, proof that Japanese women could sacrifice beauty and tradition for duty. But now those uniforms told a different story. The fabric had been worn thin by months of continuous wear, stained by mud and tears, torn by barbed wire and rough handling during their capture. Many of the women had been wearing the same clothes for 3 months, since their units had been overrun in the final desperate weeks of the war. The once neat pleats hung limp and shapeless. Buttons were missing. Seams had split and been hastily mended with whatever thread could be found. As the American occupation forces established control over Japan, the female auxiliary officers found themselves in an impossible position. They were not quite prisoners of war, yet they were not free to return home. Many of their families had been killed in the bombing campaigns. Their military units had been disbanded. Their purpose, their identity, their entire worldview had evaporated in the space of a single radio broadcast. They existed in a liminal state, suspended between a past that had been revealed as a lie and a future they could not imagine. On the morning of September 17th, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridors of the detention center. But these were not the heavy boots of American soldiers that the women had grown accustomed to hearing. These were lighter steps, accompanied by the rustle of fabric and the soft murmur of female voices speaking in English. The Japanese women looked up with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension as the door to their quarters swung open. What they saw defied every assumption they had been taught about American women. 3 figures entered the room, their crisp uniforms immediately recognizable as belonging to the American Red Cross and the Women's Army Corps. The first woman, Captain Sarah Mitchell from Kansas, wore the olive-drab uniform of the WASC with quiet authority. Her brown hair was neatly pinned beneath her military cap, and her bearing spoke of competence and professionalism. Behind her came Mrs. Dorothy Henderson, a Red Cross volunteer from Minnesota, her gray dress and distinctive Red Cross armband marking her as a humanitarian worker. The third woman, Sergeant Mary O'Sullivan from Boston, carried several large canvas bags that seemed to strain under their weight. The contrast was immediate and jarring. Where the Japanese women sat in their tattered monpei, these American women wore clean, well-fitted uniforms that spoke of a nation that had not known hunger or desperation. Their clothes were intact, pressed, and purposeful. Their shoes were polished. Their faces, while serious, did not carry the hollow look of defeat that marked their Japanese counterparts. Captain Mitchell stepped forward and, through a Japanese interpreter, addressed the women in the room. Her words were formal but not unkind. "We have brought clothing and personal items. Each of you will receive what you need." The interpreter's voice carried a slight tremor as he translated these impossible words. The Japanese women exchanged glances of confusion and suspicion. This was not the behavior they had been taught to expect from their enemies. What the Japanese officers had expected from their American captors was harsh treatment, if not outright cruelty. They had been indoctrinated with stories of American brutality, told that surrender would bring only humiliation and death. The propaganda films they had watched showed American women as frivolous beings concerned only with luxury and self-indulgence, incapable of understanding concepts like honor or sacrifice. They had been taught that American women were pampered creatures who had never known hardship, who would look upon Japanese women with contempt and disgust. Instead, they watched in growing bewilderment as Mrs. Henderson opened the first of the canvas bags and began to remove items of clothing. There were clean cotton dresses in simple patterns, practical but feminine. There were undergarments, still in their packages, speaking of care and forethought. There were shoes. Not military boots, but comfortable, well-made civilian shoes in various sizes. There were sweaters, soft and warm, in colors that the Japanese women had almost forgotten existed. Most surprisingly, there were small personal items: combs, mirrors, bars of soap, and tubes of toothpaste. Sergeant O'Sullivan approached Lieutenant Tanaka first, holding a pale blue dress with small white flowers printed on the fabric. The garment was simple but beautiful, made of quality cotton that felt impossibly soft after months of rough military cloth. "This looks like it might fit you," O'Sullivan said gently, though Tanaka could not understand the words. The American woman's tone, however, needed no translation. It was kind, respectful, even hesitant, as if she were afraid of causing offense. Tanaka stared at the dress for a long moment, her mind struggling to process what was happening. The fabric was clean. It smelled of soap and sunshine rather than sweat and fear. The seams were straight and strong, the buttons securely attached. It was a dress that spoke of a world where women had choices, where clothing was about more than mere survival. For months, Tanaka had worn the same monpei uniform because it was the only clothing she possessed. The idea that someone would simply give her new clothes, beautiful clothes, without expecting anything in return, was incomprehensible. The emotion began as a tightness in her throat. Tanaka tried to maintain the stoic bearing that had been drilled into her during her military training. Japanese women did not cry, especially not in front of enemies. But as she reached out with trembling fingers to touch the soft fabric of the dress, the dam of her composure began to crack. This simple garment represented more than just clothing. It represented the possibility of being seen as a human being rather than a defeated enemy. It suggested that perhaps the Americans did not view Japanese women as monsters deserving only contempt. Second Lieutenant Yamamoto received a green dress with small pearl buttons and a matching cardigan. Mrs. Henderson knelt beside her, holding the garments up to check the size. The Red Cross volunteers' movements were careful and respectful, treating Yamamoto not as a prisoner, but as any woman might be treated while shopping for clothes. Henderson even smiled, a genuine expression of warmth that pierced through the fog of defeat and despair that had surrounded Yamamoto for months. As more of the Japanese women received their new clothing, the emotional floodgates began to open throughout the room. These were women who had been trained to suppress their feelings, to view emotional display as weakness unworthy of those who served the emperor. They had prided themselves on their ability to endure hardship without complaint, to face death without tears. But the simple act of receiving clean, beautiful clothes from their former enemies broke through defenses that months of bombing and defeat had not been able to penetrate. Lieutenant Sachiko Mori, a 23-year-old communications officer from Osaka, held a yellow sundress against her chest and began to weep openly. The dress was exactly the kind of garment she had dreamed of wearing before the war, when she had been a university student with hopes of becoming a teacher. The soft cotton fabric reminded her of the dresses her mother had sewn for her, dresses that had been sacrificed to make Montpei when the war demanded it. The tears that fell were not just for the dress, but for the life she had lost, the innocence that had been stripped away, and the unexpected kindness of women she had been taught to hate. Captain Noriko Ishida, at 28 the oldest woman in the group, received a navy blue dress with white trim that reminded her painfully of her pre-war teaching uniform. She had run a girls' school in Nagoya before volunteering for military service, and the sight of proper civilian clothes brought flooding back memories of the young students she had taught to read and write before teaching them to die for the emperor instead. As she held the dress, her military composure cracked completely, and she sobbed with the kind of deep, wrenching grief that comes from recognizing how much has been lost. The American women watched these displays of emotion with their own mixture of feelings. Captain Mitchell had served in the European theater before being transferred to Japan, and she had seen the aftermath of war before. But there was something particularly heartbreaking about these Japanese women, so young and so thoroughly broken by the collapse of everything they had believed in. These were not hardened soldiers or fanatical civilians. They were educated women, many barely out of their teens, who had given everything to a cause that had ultimately betrayed them. Mrs. Henderson, a mother of 3 daughters back in Minnesota, found herself deeply moved by the sight of these young women crying over simple dresses. She had volunteered for Red Cross service partly to help provide aid to those in need, but she had expected to feel more emotional distance from Japanese recipients. The propaganda back home had portrayed the Japanese as an alien, incomprehensible enemy. But watching Lieutenant Tanaka carefully fold and refold her new dress, treating it like a precious treasure, Henderson saw not an enemy but a young woman not much different from her own daughters. The moment that crystallized the emotional impact of this encounter came when Sergeant O'Sullivan approached the youngest woman in the group, 19-year-old Corporal Keiko Sato. Sato had been a radio operator with a signals unit that had been overrun on Okinawa. She had watched most of her unit die in the final battles of the war, and had survived only by hiding in caves for weeks before being found by American forces. Her Monpei uniform was in the worst condition of all, more holes than fabric, held together by strips of cloth torn from other garments. O'Sullivan knelt beside Sato and held out a soft pink dress with tiny white flowers embroidered around the collar. It was clearly a dress made for a young woman, something appropriate for a college student or a new bride. As Sato took the garment in her hands, she began to tremble violently. The dress was so beautiful, so impossibly clean and whole, that it seemed to belong to a different world entirely. For months, Sato had lived like an animal, scavenging for food, hiding in ruins, wearing rags. The idea that she could wear something beautiful again, something that would make her feel human, was overwhelming. The tears came in great shuddering sobs that seemed to tear from her chest. These were not the dignified tears of sorrow that might be appropriate for a Japanese woman of breeding. These were the raw, ugly tears of a broken child who had endured more than any 19-year-old should have to bear. As she cried, she held the pink dress against her face, breathing in the clean scent of the fabric, feeling the softness against her skin. The symbolism of the dress was not lost on any of the women in the room, Japanese or American. This simple garment represented the abundance of a nation that had not known true hardship during the war years. While Japanese women had been cutting up their silk kimonos to make practical monpei, American women had continued to have access to beautiful, well-made clothing. The dress spoke of factories that had not been bombed, of a civilian population that had not gone hungry, of a society that had maintained its prosperity even while fighting a global war. But more than material abundance, the dresses represented a fundamentally different approach to conquered peoples. The Japanese military had taught its soldiers that enemies deserved no mercy, that kindness was weakness, that the defeated should be crushed without pity. These women had been raised on stories of samurai honor that demanded death before dishonor, of a warrior culture that viewed compassion as contemptible. Yet here were their conquerors, offering not humiliation but humanity, not punishment but practical help. As the distribution of clothing continued, other symbolic elements emerged. Mrs. Henderson produced small packages of soap, each wrapped in paper and tied with ribbon. To the Japanese women, who had not seen soap in months, these small bars represented luxury almost beyond imagination. The soap was white and clean, with a faint floral scent that spoke of a world where women still had the time and resources to care about such niceties. Captain Mitchell distributed small hand mirrors, each in its own protective case. For women who had not seen their reflections clearly in months, who had almost forgotten what they looked like when not wearing military uniforms, these mirrors were both gift and revelation. As the Japanese women looked at themselves, many gasped at their own appearance. Their faces were gaunt, their hair lank and unkempt, their skin weathered by months of hardship. But reflected in the mirrors, surrounded by the frame of their new dresses, they could also see glimpses of the women they had been before the war, and perhaps hints of who they might become after it. The transformation that took place in that detention center room went far beyond the simple exchange of old clothes for new. Each Japanese woman who accepted a dress from the American women was forced to confront fundamental assumptions about enemies and allies, about strength and weakness, about the nature of defeat and victory. They had been taught that American women were their inferiors, weak creatures who had contributed nothing to their nation's war effort. Yet here were American women in military uniforms, women who had clearly played important roles in their country's victory, treating their defeated enemies with a kindness that Japanese military culture would have considered inappropriate weakness. Lieutenant Tanaka, now holding her blue dress like a talisman, found herself thinking about the American woman who had given it to her. Captain Mitchell could not have been much older than Tanaka herself, yet she carried herself with an authority that spoke of real responsibility and achievement. Her uniform was not a costume or a symbol. It was evidence of genuine service to her country. The realization that American women had contributed meaningfully to their nation's war effort while Japanese women had ultimately been relegated to auxiliary roles was disturbing to everything Tanaka had been taught about female roles and capabilities. The emotional impact of the encounter was complicated by the Japanese women's recognition of their own appearance. In their tattered monpei uniforms, they represented not the proud female warriors they had imagined themselves to be, but defeated, desperate refugees. The contrast with the crisp, clean uniforms of the American women was stark and humiliating. Yet the Americans did not seem to take pleasure in this contrast. Instead, they appeared genuinely concerned with providing practical help and restoring some measure of dignity to their former enemies. Second Lieutenant Yamamoto, clutching her green dress and cardigan, began to understand that the Americans saw her not as a dangerous enemy who needed to be crushed, but as a young woman who needed help. This perspective was so foreign to her understanding of military conduct that it challenged everything she thought she knew about warfare and international relations. Japanese military doctrine held that enemies were to be either destroyed or converted through superior force and ideology. The concept of providing aid to defeated enemies without demanding ideological conversion or political submission was incomprehensible within her worldview. As the afternoon wore on and each Japanese woman received her new clothing, the emotional atmosphere in the room continued to intensify. These women had not cried when their units were overrun. They had not wept when they were captured or when they learned of Japan's surrender. They had maintained their military bearing through months of uncertainty and hardship. But the simple kindness of receiving new clothes broke down emotional barriers that military discipline had kept in place. The tears were not just about the clothing, though the dresses and personal items were deeply meaningful to women who had owned almost nothing for months. The tears were about the recognition that they had been seen as human beings deserving of basic dignity and care. They were about the collapse of a worldview that had divided humanity into Japanese and subhuman others. They were about the beginning of an understanding that their enemies were not the monsters they had been taught to expect, but people capable of compassion and generosity. Mrs. Henderson, watching the emotional scenes around her, was struck by how young these Japanese women were. Most were barely out of their teens, and all showed the physical and emotional effects of prolonged stress and hardship. The Red Cross volunteer found herself thinking of her own daughters and wondering how they would have fared under similar circumstances. The thought that these young women had volunteered to serve in their military, just as her own daughters might have done in similar circumstances, made it impossible to view them as foreign or alien. Sergeant O'Sullivan, distributing the last of the clothing, observed the careful way each Japanese woman handled her new dress. They folded and refolded the garments, smoothed the fabric, examined every button and seam. These were not the actions of people who took material goods for granted. These were the actions of people who had learned to treasure every small comfort, who understood the true value of simple necessities that peacetime populations took for granted. The symbolic power of the dresses extended beyond their material value to what they represented about American society and values. Each garment had been manufactured in factories that had remained productive throughout the war, sewn by workers who had remained safe from enemy attack, distributed through systems that had continued to function effectively despite global conflict. The availability of such clothing for distribution to former enemies spoke to an industrial capacity and social stability that Japan had never possessed and had ultimately been unable to match. But perhaps more importantly, the dresses represented a conception of womanhood that was fundamentally different from what the Japanese women had been taught. These were clothes designed for women who expected to have choices, who anticipated being able to participate in social and economic life as individuals, rather than merely as servants of state ideology. The cut and style of the dresses assumed that the women wearing them would have some degree of personal agency, some opportunity to express individual taste and preference. For Japanese women who had spent years being told that their highest aspiration should be to sacrifice themselves for the emperor, the idea that clothing might be chosen for beauty as well as function was revelatory. The small floral prints, the careful attention to color and design, the inclusion of accessories like cardigans and belts, all suggested that the women who would wear these clothes were expected to care about their appearance for its own sake, not merely as a reflection of their devotion to military or political ideals. As evening approached and the American women prepared to leave, the emotional atmosphere in the room remained charged. Many of the Japanese women continued to cry, though their tears had evolved from the initial shock of receiving unexpected kindness to a more complex mixture of gratitude, shame, and confusion. They were grateful for the clothing and the dignity it restored, but ashamed that they needed such charity from their former enemies. They were confused by the gap between what they had been taught to expect from Americans and the reality of how they were being treated. Lieutenant Tanaka approached Captain Mitchell before the Americans departed, bowing deeply in the formal Japanese manner. Through the interpreter, she attempted to express her gratitude, but words seemed inadequate to convey the emotional impact of what had occurred. Mitchell responded with a slight bow of her own, a gesture of respect that further challenged Tanaka's assumptions about American attitudes toward Japanese people and customs. The parting scene was awkward but meaningful. The American women gathered their empty bags and prepared to return to their own quarters, their official duties completed. The Japanese women remained in the detention center, but they were no longer the same women who had sat in tattered Monpei uniforms that morning. They now possessed not only new clothing, but new questions about themselves, their enemies, and the nature of the conflict that had consumed their lives. That night, as the Japanese women prepared for sleep, many of them carefully folded their new dresses and placed them beside their sleeping mats. Some held the fabric to their faces, breathing in the clean scent that reminded them of a world beyond military barracks and detention centers. Others simply stared at their new possessions, trying to understand what it meant to own something beautiful again. The pink dress that Corporal Sato had received became a focal point for the group's emotional processing of the day's events. Sato, the youngest and most visibly affected by the encounter, spent hours that evening examining every detail of the garment. She traced the delicate embroidery around the collar with her fingertip, marveled at the tiny pearl buttons, held the soft cotton fabric against her cheek. For a woman who had survived weeks in caves, eating roots and rainwater, the dress represented a return to civilization and femininity that she had thought was lost forever. The other women watched Sato's interaction with her dress and saw reflected in it their own complex feelings about what had happened. The garment was undeniably beautiful, more beautiful than anything any of them had owned in years. But it was also a symbol of their defeat and dependence, a reminder that they had been reduced to accepting charity from their enemies. The mixture of gratitude and humiliation was difficult to process. Lieutenant Yamamoto found herself thinking about the American women who had distributed the clothing. Their competence and authority challenged everything she had been taught about Western women. Captain Mitchell in particular had displayed a quiet professionalism that spoke of real responsibility and achievement. The idea that women in enemy countries might have played significant roles in their nation's war effort, while Japanese women had been relegated primarily to support functions, was disturbing to Yamamoto's understanding of her own society's supposed superiority. The evening also brought practical considerations about when and how to wear their new clothes. The Japanese women were still technically detainees, still living in converted institutional buildings under American supervision. Would it be appropriate to wear civilian dresses in their current circumstances? Would doing so be seen as abandoning their military identity or as accepting their defeat too readily? These questions had no clear answers, but they forced the women to think about who they were and who they wanted to be in this new post-war reality. Mrs. Henderson, returning to her quarters in the American compound, found herself deeply affected by the day's events. She had volunteered for Red Cross service expecting to provide humanitarian aid, but she had not anticipated the emotional complexity of working with former enemies. The sight of those young Japanese women crying over simple dresses had humanized the enemy in a way that no amount of official policy could have accomplished. The Red Cross volunteer wrote in her diary that evening, "Today I gave clothing to Japanese women who had nothing but rags. I expected to feel satisfaction at helping those in need, but instead I feel something more complicated." These women were not the fanatics I had been told to expect. They were young, frightened, and heartbreakingly grateful for the smallest kindness. It makes me wonder what other assumptions about our enemies might be wrong. Captain Mitchell, completing her official report on the day's activities, struggled to find appropriate language to describe what had occurred. The distribution of clothing was a routine humanitarian operation, the kind of activity that American forces were undertaking throughout occupied Japan. But the emotional response of the Japanese women had transformed a simple logistics exercise into something more profound. Mitchell wrote, "Distribution completed successfully. Recipients showed strong emotional response to receiving new clothing. Recommend continued humanitarian efforts as contribution to pacification objectives." The bureaucratic language of the official report could not capture the human reality of what had happened in that detention center room. The transformation of 37 Japanese women from defeated enemies into individuals deserving of compassion and aid represented a fundamental shift in how both sides viewed each other. For the Americans, it was a recognition that their former enemies were not monsters, but people capable of gratitude and suffering. For the Japanese, It was the beginning of an understanding that their defeat did not necessarily mean their destruction. In the weeks that followed, the impact of that September afternoon continued to reverberate through both communities. The Japanese women began to wear their new dresses, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. The transformation was remarkable. Clean, well-fitted civilian clothing restored not only their physical appearance, but their sense of self-worth and dignity. They began to see themselves not just as defeated military personnel, but as women with the possibility of rebuilding their lives. The dresses became conversation pieces, ways for the Japanese women to connect with each other and process their changing circumstances. They shared stories about the American women who had given them the clothes, trying to understand the motivations behind such unexpected kindness. They helped each other with buttons and zippers, skills that had been unnecessary in their military uniforms but were essential for their new civilian clothes. More broadly, the clothing distribution became part of a larger transformation in how Japanese women understood their role in post-war society. The dresses, with their assumption that women might dress for beauty as well as function, suggested possibilities that had been suppressed during the war years. The idea that women might have choices about their appearance, their activities, and their futures was beginning to take root. For the American women involved in the distribution, the experience became a defining moment in their understanding of occupation duties and international relations. They had expected to encounter enemy civilians who would be hostile, or at best sullenly accepting of American aid. Instead, they had found young women whose gratitude and emotional response had created unexpected bonds of human connection across cultural and national lines. The symbolic power of the dresses extended far beyond their immediate practical value. Each garment represented the abundance of American society, the productive capacity that had allowed the United States to supply both its own military forces and provide aid to former enemies. The quality of the fabric, the attention to design and construction, the very fact that such items were available for distribution, all testified to an industrial and social system that had remained strong throughout the war. But the dresses also represented something more fundamental about American values and approaches to post-war reconstruction. The decision to provide civilian clothing to former enemy personnel reflected a belief that rehabilitation was possible, that defeated enemies could be transformed into peaceful neighbors given appropriate treatment. This approach was radically different from traditional patterns of conquest and occupation, where defeated peoples were typically subjected to punishment and exploitation rather than aid and reconstruction. The tears shed by the Japanese women that September afternoon were tears of recognition that they had been seen as human, beings deserving of dignity and care, recognition that their enemies were capable of mercy and generosity, and recognition that the world they had known had ended, but that something new and potentially better might be beginning. Years later, when Japan had been transformed from occupied territory to valued ally, when Japanese women had gained rights and opportunities that would have been unimaginable during the war years, some of those women would look back on that September afternoon as a turning point. The moment when American women had given them new clothes had been the moment when they began to understand that defeat did not mean destruction, that enemies could become friends, and that even in the depths of despair, unexpected kindness could light the way toward hope. The pink dress that had made 19-year-old Corporal Sato cry so bitterly became her most treasured possession. She wore it when she married an American soldier 2 years later, transforming from defeated enemy to war bride to American citizen. The green dress and cardigan given to Lieutenant Yamamoto accompanied her to the United States, where she became a teacher and raised 3 daughters who grew up knowing both their Japanese heritage and their American identity. Lieutenant Tanaka's blue dress with white flowers was packed carefully in a trunk when she returned to a devastated Japan to help rebuild her country's educational system, carrying with her not just American clothing but American ideas about democracy, opportunity, and the treatment of former enemies. The simple act of giving clothing to women in need had rippled outward, creating connections and possibilities that no military strategist could have planned or predicted. In a moment when the world was being reshaped by force and ideology, when nations were being rebuilt according to the visions of their conquerors, a group of American women had chosen to see their former enemies not as objects of policy but as individuals deserving of basic human dignity. The tears cried that September afternoon were tears that watered. The seeds of reconciliation, understanding, and ultimately friendship between peoples who had been taught to see each other as alien and hostile. They were tears that recognized the power of simple human kindness to bridge even the deepest divides of war and ideology. They were tears that testified to the truth that beneath the uniforms of enemies and allies alike beat hearts capable of compassion, gratitude, and hope. In the end, the story of those 37 Japanese women and their American benefactors became part of the larger story of how enemies become friends, how societies transform themselves, and how individual acts of kindness can alter the course of history. The dresses distributed that day were more than clothing. They were symbols of abundance triumphing over scarcity, of mercy defeating revenge, and of the possibility that, even in the aftermath of the most destructive war in human history, people of different nations and cultures could choose to see each other not as eternal enemies, but as fellow human beings deserving of respect, dignity, and hope. The tears that fell that September afternoon were the last tears of war and the first tears of peace, marking not just the end of one chapter in human history, but the beginning of another, a chapter written not in the language of conquest and defeat, but in the universal language of human compassion and the enduring power of unexpected kindness to heal even the deepest wounds of conflict and mistrust.